By mid-morning, the towering sandstone cliffs of the Jask coastal range were completely fractured, pouring massive columns of thick, toxic chemical smoke into the sky over the Gulf of Oman. Deep inside the burning rock, pulverized steel blast doors and collapsed mountain tunnels buried dozens of heavy anti-ship cruise missiles under violent, rolling secondary explosions. The coastal defense network that had guarded the eastern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz for decades was entirely erased, leaving 20 shoreline rocket bunkers reduced to burning concrete craters. The sheer scale of the structural collapse sent shockwaves of dust miles out over the water, temporarily blinding satellite reconnaissance and blacking out the sun. The question was not whether the subterranean fortress had been destroyed, but what had provoked a United States Navy carrier strike group to unleash such absolute, mountain-cracking firepower. To understand how the entire mountain range was turned into a burning graveyard, the timeline must rewind to the moment the electronic tripwire was crossed. 2 hours before sunrise, at exactly 3:45 in the morning on the 22nd of June, 2026, the coastal winds off the Jask Peninsula were heavy with salt. 150 nautical miles offshore, a massive United States Navy carrier strike group was holding a defensive formation in the dark waters of the Arabian Sea. High above the fleet, an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye radar warning aircraft carved a slow circle through the night sky, scanning the jagged coastline. Inside the darkened fuselage, sensor operators listened to the hum of the cooling fans and stared at their digital displays, watching the green glow of the mainland mapping sweeps. The coast had been quiet for days. Then, without warning, the electromagnetic spectrum exploded. Down in the electronic warfare compartments across the fleet, tactical screens suddenly flashed with high-intensity warning strobes. Shoreline radar systems, previously hidden deep within the mountain ridges, were powering up simultaneously. These were not routine sweeping radars, searching for general maritime traffic. These were dedicated, high-frequency fire control arrays belonging to the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps coastal missile forces. Operators listened as the audio feed of the radar warning receivers turned from a low static hiss into a rapid, aggressive shrieking tone. Within seconds, the digital threat library identified the emissions. The tracking signals belonged to anti-ship cruise missile targeting networks, and their invisible beams were actively painting the American destroyers. Aboard the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the command center immediately transitioned from a routine watch posture to high combat alert. Red general quarters lights began flashing through the narrow steel corridors of the 1,000-foot vessel. The piercing shriek of the combat alarm echoed across the sprawling hangar bay and out over the windswept flight deck, sending hundreds of flight crew personnel sprinting. In the Combat Direction Center, commanders watched the tactical plot as more hostile signals broke through the coastal clutter. The entire Jask coastline was lighting up. Shoreline artillery units and mobile surface-to-air missile networks were rapidly shifting from standby into active tracking mode, casting a web of invisible electronic tripwires across the sky. High above the dark water, electronic attack pilots flying EA-18G Growlers reported that the enemy radar locks were firming up into continuous tracking beams. The subterranean missile caves, dug deep into the rock formations of the coast, were opening their massive steel blast doors. Inside those unyielding tunnels, hydraulic launchers were already elevating dozens of heavy anti-ship rockets into firing position, preparing to saturate the sea with high explosives. The American strike group had unknowingly sailed into the crosshairs of a carefully synchronized ambush, and the enemy fire control computers were only seconds away from completing their final firing solutions. The fleet was instantly forced into a massive tactical escalation, knowing that the only way to survive the incoming barrage was to tear the mountain apart before the rockets could leave their launch rails. With the American carrier strike group now firmly clamped inside the targeting crosshairs of the Iranian coastal missile network, the fleet violently shifted from a defensive transit posture into a massive, preemptive suppression operation. There was no time for diplomatic de-escalation, and there was no space to outrun the threat. The distance between the shoreline launchers and the carrier was less than 150 nautical miles. It was a gap that supersonic sea-skimming missiles would cross in under 10 minutes. The only way to save the 1,000-foot flagship and its escorting destroyers was to physically dismantle the Jask mountain range before the subterranean firing sequence could be completed. Aboard the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier at the center of the formation, the flight deck turned into a highly synchronized theater of war. Under the glow of red floodlights, flight directors sprinted across the rough, non-slip coating, guiding heavily armed strike fighters toward the steam catapults. The deafening scream of jet engines drowned out the crashing of the ocean waves against the hull. F-35C Lightning, 2 stealth fighters, loaded with heavy 2,000-pound bunker-busting munitions hidden inside their internal weapon bays, locked into the launch shuttles. Beside them, F-A-18 Super Hornets, carrying advanced anti-radiation missiles and electronic jamming pods, extended their wings and spooled their twin engines up to maximum military power. One by one, the catapult officers dropped into a low crouch, touching the deck to signal the launch. High-pressure steam erupted from the catapult tracks as the heavy fighters were violently hurled off the bow, dropping slightly before catching the air and tearing into the pitch-black sky over the Arabian Sea. Within minutes, a massive airborne strike package was assembling in the darkness, climbing rapidly toward their attack altitudes. The heavy smell of burning aviation fuel and superheated steam drifted through the humid night air as the carrier banked heavily into the wind, maintaining launch speed to push the second wave of its air wing off the deck. 10 miles ahead of the carrier, the guided missile cruisers and destroyers forming the outer defensive shield were simultaneously preparing for a catastrophic volume of fire. The massive warships accelerated, their gas turbine engines roaring as they pushed their bows through the dark swells, throwing white water into the air. Deep inside the steel hulls of the escort ships, the Aegis combat systems automatically populated target lists, prioritizing the hostile radar emitters actively lighting up the coastline. Down in the weapon magazines, automated handling systems primed dozens of Tomahawk Land Attack Missiles. On the forward decks of the destroyers, the heavy steel hatches of the Mark 41 vertical launch systems slammed open in rapid succession. The mechanical clanking of the armored doors echoed across the black water, exposing rows of deadly, deep-strike cruise missiles to the open air. The shipboard computers were rapidly downloading the exact satellite coordinates of the hidden Jask cave openings, locking the geographical data into the internal guidance systems of the waiting weapons. Inside the darkened combat direction center of the strike group commander, the digital displays showed a rapidly shrinking timeline. The enemy coastal batteries were completing their final targeting protocols. If the Revolutionary Guard forces managed to unleash their full subterranean stockpile at once, the sheer number of incoming radar-evading missiles would easily saturate the fleet's defensive interceptors and tear the warships apart. The strike group had to strike first, and it had to strike with enough concussive force to collapse the mountain tunnels entirely. The entire military machine of the carrier strike group was now fully awake, fully armed, and driving straight into the lethal engagement envelope of the Jask coastal range. The countdown to absolute kinetic conflict had reached its final seconds, and the sky above the fleet was about to be torn open. As the American carrier strike group drove directly into the engagement envelope of the Iranian coastal defense grid, the battle for the Jask mountain range opened with an invisible, devastating electromagnetic assault. High above the dark water, a flight of EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft banked hard toward the shoreline, their wing-mounted jamming pods radiating massive amounts of directed microwave energy. The airspace between the fleet and the coastline instantly became a saturated corridor of heavy electronic interference. Down in the subterranean command bunkers of the Revolutionary Guard, operators staring at bright green air defense screens suddenly lost their tracking pictures. Instead of clear, predictable flight paths, the radar scopes fractured into chaotic, dancing waves of white noise. The precise targeting locks that had clamped onto the American destroyers only moments before began to break apart, leaving the coastal missile batteries functionally blind in the dark. Recognizing that their primary sensors were being flooded with high-intensity static, the Iranian commanders did not wait for visual confirmation. They ordered their mobile air defense units to immediately switch to backup optical tracking and thermal imaging. Along the coastal ridges, anti-aircraft artillery crews frantically cranked manual targeting wheels, pouring heavy streams of red tracer fire blindly into the low cloud cover. The night sky over the Gulf of Oman was suddenly illuminated by the frantic, intersecting arcs of unguided flak, creating a deadly lattice of glowing metal in a desperate attempt to hit the unseen American strike fighters. Inside the deep missile tunnels, the Iranian crews were operating under extreme pressure, fighting against their own blinded computers. Heavy hydraulic launch arms groaned as they attempted to elevate their anti-ship cruise missiles without reliable telemetry. Sirens blared inside the concrete corridors as commanders ordered their crews to fire using pre-programmed area saturation coordinates, hoping to blanket the ocean with enough high explosives to clip an American warship by sheer volume alone. But the American stealth fighters were already slipping right through the gaps in the blinded radar net. Flying miles above the chaotic anti-aircraft fire, the advanced sensors of the F-35C Lightning, two aircraft peered directly into the heavily fortified mountain ravines. Inside the tight, oxygen-fed cockpits, the strike pilots watched their digital helmet displays as advanced targeting pods synthesized thermal signatures, satellite mapping, and real-time electronic intelligence. They were not looking for the mountain itself. They were looking for the massive steel blast doors cutting into the rock. On the digital crosshairs, the reinforced concrete portals of the 6 primary missile caves glowed bright white against the cold, dark sandstone. Tactical data networks instantly shared these precise, three-dimensional coordinates across the entire American formation. Out on the dark ocean, the guided missile destroyers were moving at flank speed, slicing through the heavy swells while leaving massive, churning wakes of white foam. Below the decks, the weapons officers gripped their firing consoles, watching the target locks solidify from blinking yellow cursors into solid red diamonds. Deep inside the automated vertical launch cells, the internal gyroscopes of the waiting Tomahawk cruise missiles spun up to thousands of revolutions per minute, digesting the exact trajectory data needed to thread the weapons through the narrow mountain valleys and directly into the cave mouths. The entire coastal defense network was now completely exposed and mathematically locked by the American firing computers, while the Iranian defenders continued to fire blindly into the electronic fog. The brief window for a preemptive strike was closing. The strike group commander, watching the synchronized tactical plot from the carrier, saw that the electronic jamming corridors were holding and the final target coordinates were confirmed. The invisible phase of the battle was over, and the time for absolute kinetic destruction had arrived. At exactly 3:55 in the morning, the strike group commander aboard the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier issued the final execution order, committing the entire American naval formation to absolute kinetic conflict. Across the dark surface of the Arabian Sea, the perimeter of guided missile cruisers and destroyers simultaneously erupted into blinding white light. The heavy steel hatches of the Mark 41 vertical launch systems slammed open, and dozens of Tomahawk Land Attack Missiles blasted out of their armored cells. The sheer concussive force of the solid fuel rocket boosters sent massive shockwaves rolling across the water, violently shaking the steel decks of the escort ships and stripping the paint from the launch housings. Thick clouds of superheated gray smoke and orange fire instantly enveloped the forward sections of the warships as a continuous, deafening roar drowned out the sound of the ocean. One after another, the heavy cruise missiles punched straight up into the humid night sky, riding columns of blinding exhaust before pitching violently forward. Their booster rockets jettisoned, falling backward into the churning sea as the turbofan engines ignited with a low, mechanical scream. The missiles dropped down until they were skimming less than 50 feet above the dark swells, accelerating to high subsonic speeds as they formed a massive, synchronized wave of flying high explosives. They were programmed to fly beneath the curvature of the Earth and the lowest thresholds of the Iranian coastal radar nets, weaving through the electromagnetic jamming corridors carved out by the electronic attack aircraft above. Miles above this low-altitude missile swarm, the second layer of the American strike package unleashed its own devastating payload. Inside the freezing cockpits of the F-35C Lightning, two stealth fighters, pilots squeezed their flight stick triggers, commanding the internal weapon bays of their aircraft to snap open. Heavy 2,000-pound joint direct attack munitions fell from the bellies of the fighters. As soon as the massive penetrator bombs cleared the slipstream, their titanium guidance wings snapped outward. The weapons pitched their heavy noses down toward the Jask mountain range, falling away from the aircraft and building tremendous kinetic energy as they dropped through the thin air. Just behind the stealth fighters, a squadron of FA-18 Super Hornets rolled inverted and ripple-fired a barrage of advanced anti-radiation missiles. These specialized supersonic rockets ignited with a violent flash, streaking down toward the coastline at over Mach 2. They were not designed to penetrate the deep mountain caves, but to hunt down the mobile air defense batteries by riding the enemy radar emissions straight back to their source. Within seconds, the sky between the American fleet and the Iranian mainland was filled with hundreds of thousands of pounds of incoming ordnance. The horizon glowed with the combined exhaust signatures of over 50 cruise missiles, glide bombs, and radar-hunting rockets, all converging on a single 30-mile stretch of the Jask Peninsula. The Iranian coastal defenders, still struggling to see through the heavy electronic static blinding their screens, could only listen to the terrifying acoustic roar echoing off the low cloud cover. The tactical element of surprise was entirely gone, replaced by the overwhelming, mechanical certainty of massed American firepower. The hydraulic launch arms inside the mainland tunnels were still whining as crews tried to elevate their anti-ship rockets into firing position. But the race to shoot first had already been lost. The airspace above the Gulf of Oman was no longer empty. It was a solid wall of incoming steel and high explosives, screaming directly toward the hidden bunker doors. The low-flying swarm of Tomahawk cruise missiles crossed the final stretch of dark water, screaming over the jagged coastline at nearly 600 miles per hour. At exactly 3:58 in the morning, the first wave of heavy, high-explosive warheads slammed directly into the outer defensive ring of the Jask mountain base. The impact was catastrophic. 20 shoreline rocket bunkers, designed to protect the immediate approaches to the subterranean caves, were hit simultaneously. Massive concrete structures, heavily reinforced with thick steel rebar, instantly burst outward in spectacular fountains of pulverized rock and blinding orange fire. The sheer concussive shockwaves from the synchronized detonations rolled across the peninsula, shattering the remaining communications towers and flattening observation posts along the cliffs. Inside the outer bunkers, the Iranian coastal artillery crews never had a chance to complete their firing sequences. A 1,000-pound cruise missile warhead punched straight through the reinforced roof of the primary coastal command node, detonating deep inside the operational control room. The extreme force of the explosion lifted the entire structure off its deep foundation before collapsing it into a burning, unrecognizable crater. Secondary detonations quickly followed across the shoreline as the highly volatile solid fuel of the unlaunched anti-ship missiles rapidly ignited. High-pressure fire jetted out of the ruined concrete domes, turning the coastal ridge into a chain of erupting volcanoes. The heavy hydraulic launch rails melted and warped under the extreme heat, trapping the remaining weapons inside their tubes before they violently cooked off. Thick, toxic chemical smoke immediately began pouring down the steep sandstone slopes, mixing with the blowing dust and burying the shoreline in an impenetrable black cloud. Just seconds after the cruise missiles tore the outer defensive bunkers apart, the supersonic anti-radiation missiles fired by the American Super Hornets arrived. Streaking down from the upper atmosphere at over 2,000 miles per hour, the radar-hunting rockets slammed directly into the active mobile air defense batteries that had been desperately pumping unguided flak into the night sky. The supersonic impacts shattered the heavy armored launch vehicles, throwing burning tires, twisted hydraulic arms, and shattered radar dishes hundreds of feet into the hot night air. The heavy anti-aircraft artillery emplacements were violently silenced in a rolling sequence of rapid, devastating explosions. The external security buffer of the Jask coastal range was now entirely stripped away. The surface defenses were utterly erased in less than 90 seconds of concentrated naval firepower. The burning wreckage illuminated the steep sandstone ravines, casting flickering orange shadows over the massive steel blast doors that protected the main underground arsenals. But the destruction of the outer bunkers was only the first phase of the assault. High above the chaotic inferno, the heavy stealth fighters were already directly overhead. Their 2,000-pound bunker-busting munitions had already been released from their internal weapon bays. The heavy titanium glide bombs were silently dropping through the smoke cover, building tremendous kinetic energy as they plunged directly toward the newly exposed cave mouths. The Iranian forces, surviving inside the deep tunnels, suddenly felt the massive vibrations of the surface explosions, shaking the rock walls, realizing that the mountain above them had been stripped bare, and the true killing blow was already falling from the sky. Even with their outer coastal defenses completely shattered by the first wave of American cruise missiles, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces did not surrender the airspace. The destruction of the immediate shoreline bunkers had been absolute, but the deepest layers of the Jask mountain defense grid remained intact. Miles inland from the burning coastal ridge, hidden within deep, shadowed valleys that the Tomahawk missiles had deliberately bypassed, a secondary network of highly mobile air defense systems suddenly woke up. These were the Khordad-15 batteries, independent and fully integrated surface-to-air missile platforms designed to survive exactly this kind of overwhelming initial bombardment. Because they operated on secure, buried fiber optic lines rather than vulnerable radio networks, they had avoided the intense electronic jamming that blinded the coastal radars. Now, their heavy transport erector vehicles rolled out from camouflaged rock overhangs, raising their quad-launch canisters toward the sky. Inside the sealed command cabins of the Khordad-15 units, Iranian operators rapidly acquired the thermal and radar signatures of the American strike package high above the smoke layer. They did not fire in a disorganized panic. Operating with cold, professional discipline, the battery commanders linked their tracking data, formed a unified defensive perimeter, and ripple-fired their heavy interceptors. Solid-fuel Sayyad-3 surface-to-air missiles blasted out of their launch tubes with terrifying speed. The valley floors vanished under massive clouds of white exhaust and blowing dust as the heavy rockets accelerated straight up into the dark morning sky. Within seconds, dozens of glowing exhaust plumes were arching over the jagged peaks of the Jask range, creating a deadly, intersecting lattice of white smoke trails aimed directly at the American fighter jets. High above the burning coastline, the American pilots suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives. Inside the cockpits of the FA-18 Super Hornets and the F-35C Lightning, two stealth fighters, threat warning receivers, exploded with continuous, high-pitched shrieks. The automated voice of the onboard computer warned of multiple incoming missile launches from directly below. The strike fighters had just released their heavy, 2,000-pound bunker-busting bombs, making them lighter and highly maneuverable, but they were still operating deep inside an active kill zone. Pilots immediately slammed their throttles forward to maximum afterburner, violently rolling their aircraft away from the incoming radar locks. The dark sky suddenly filled with blooming clouds of burning magnesium flares and heavy clouds of metallic chaff as the American pilots deployed maximum countermeasures to break the enemy tracking beams. The crushing force of gravity pushed the pilots deep into their ejection seats as they pulled their fighters into punishing vertical dives, trying to outturn the supersonic interceptors screaming up from the mainland valleys. A Sayyad-3 missile tore through the flight path of a Super Hornet, its proximity fuse failing by a fraction of a second, sending a concussive shockwave that violently threw the 30-ton fighter onto its side. Another heavy surface-to-air missile exploded high in the stratosphere, showering the lower cloud layers with white-hot shrapnel. The American electronic warfare officers inside the Growler aircraft pushed their jamming pods to absolute maximum output, flooding the valleys with directed microwave energy to blind the remaining Iranian targeting radars. The counterattack was massive, aggressive, and highly coordinated, proving that the Jask mountain fortress was still capable of destroying the American strike wing. But by forcing the fighters to take violent, evasive action, the Iranian defenders had exposed the exact coordinates of their hidden inland valleys. The stealth fighters were already pulling out of their dives and passing the new targeting data back to the escort warships operating off the coast. The heavy surface-to-air missile barrage had temporarily disrupted the American flight formation, but it could not stop the momentum of the falling munitions. High above the chaotic dogfight of aircraft and interceptor missiles, the heavy 2,000-pound penetrator bombs were still plunging downward, dropping entirely unimpeded directly toward the massive steel doors of the subterranean missile caves. The heavy surface-to-air missile barrage raging in the upper atmosphere could do nothing to stop the momentum of the falling gravity weapons. Dropped moments before the American stealth fighters initiated their violent evasive maneuvers, over 20 specialized 2,000-pound penetrator bombs were already plunging through the thick layers of chemical smoke covering the Jask coastal range. Moving at near supersonic speeds, the heavy titanium casings screamed through the dark morning air, their guidance fins making rapid micro-adjustments to steer them precisely onto the designated coordinates. Down in the narrow mountain ravines, the remaining Iranian coastal defenders could only listen to the terrifying acoustic shriek of the falling steel. The massive, reinforced blast doors of the 6 primary missile caves had been completely stripped of their protective outer bunkers by the first cruise missile wave. Inside the tunnels, hydraulic alarms wailed continuously as commanders desperately ordered the inner blast shields sealed. But the mechanical doors were far too slow to outrun the plunging ordnance. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, the finishing strikes slammed directly into the cave mouths. The heavy munitions did not detonate on contact. Engineered specifically to destroy deeply buried, hardened targets, their solid titanium noses punched straight through the outer steel doors, shearing through heavy armor plating and shattering the thick layers of reinforced concrete behind them. The sheer kinetic force of the deep penetration warped the heavy hydraulic launching rails positioned near the entrances. Milliseconds later, buried deep inside the subterranean corridors, the delayed action fuses triggered. The resulting explosions were absolute. Trapped within the confines of the solid sandstone walls, the massive high-explosive detonations had nowhere to expand outward. The blast waves violently multiplied, driving highly pressurized, superheated shock waves deeper into the tunnel network. The extreme overpressure tore through the underground assembly bays, instantly crushing the heavy loading equipment and shattering the delicate guidance systems of the waiting anti-ship missile stockpiles. Massive steel bulkheads folded inward under the sheer concussive force. From the exterior of the mountain, the deep detonations sounded like a sequence of heavy earthquakes, but the visual result was immediate and violent. Giant plumes of pressurized dust, vaporized rock, and orange fire shot out of the cave entrances like horizontal volcanic eruptions. High up on the sandstone ridges, hidden ventilation shafts blew their heavy steel caps into the air, acting as release valves for the inferno raging beneath the earth. Before the ground could stop shaking, the second element of the American strike package arrived. A squadron of FA-18 Super Hornets dropped out of the upper cloud cover and rolled into steep, punishing dives. Sighting the brightly glowing craters of the ruined cave entrances, the pilots ripple-fired a follow-up barrage of 2,000-pound thermobaric weapons directly into the smoking holes. These secondary bombs plunged into the shattered corridors and ignited the oxygen-rich air inside. The resulting vacuum explosions ripped through the deepest sections of the arsenal, instantly vaporizing whatever remained of the interior blast walls. Miles offshore, the crews aboard the American guided missile destroyers felt the low-frequency rumble travel through the water and reverberate against their steel hulls. Through powerful optical sensors, they watched the entire Jask ridgeline light up from the inside out. The subterranean strike had achieved total penetration, severing the deep command nodes from the surface and trapping the remaining Iranian anti-ship weapons inside a collapsing, burning tomb. The extreme heat was now rapidly spreading toward the main solid fuel storage magazines deep inside the rock, triggering a catastrophic chain reaction that the mountain simply could not contain. The extreme heat, racing through the shattered corridors, finally reached the primary solid fuel storage magazines deep inside the rock, triggering a catastrophic chain reaction that the mountain simply could not contain. Hundreds of fully armed anti-ship cruise missiles, staged in deep assembly bays for a massed barrage, cooked off simultaneously. The sheer volume of detonating rocket propellant created a highly pressurized thermal vacuum deep within the bedrock. It was no longer a battle of individual airstrikes, but a continuous, roaring artificial earthquake. Deep inside the combat direction centers of the American warships, holding position offshore, acoustic sensors blared red, as localized seismic shockwaves ripped through the continental shelf and transferred violently into the dark ocean water. The structural integrity of the entire Jask coastal range suffered a catastrophic failure. From the exterior, the towering sandstone ridges overlooking the Gulf of Oman visibly bulged outward. Massive fissures opened across the stone peaks as the tremendous internal overpressure sought an exit. Suddenly, the entire seaward face of the mountain range sheared away. Millions of tons of burning rock, shattered reinforced concrete, and twisted steel blast doors collapsed outward, sliding down the steep slopes in a terrifying, fiery landslide. The roaring avalanche of pulverized stone crashed directly down upon the ruins of the 20 shoreline rocket bunkers, burying the smoldering concrete domes under a permanent, burning tomb of debris. Massive boulders and heavy steel launch rails tumbled all the way to the shoreline, plunging into the sea and sending heavy, unnatural swells crashing outward toward the American fleet. Thick, suffocating clouds of yellow chemical smoke and pulverized sandstone rolled aggressively across the peninsula, completely blacking out the emerging morning sun. Inland from the collapsing ridges, the surviving Iranian mobile air defense batteries lost their final shreds of tactical coordination. The deep fiber optic lines that had connected the independent Khordad-15 launch vehicles to their subterranean command nodes were violently severed when the Earth cracked open. Without their encrypted data links or central command guidance, the isolated surface-to-air missile crews were left entirely blind beneath the smoke layer. Concussive shockwaves from the collapsing mountain blasted through the narrow inland valleys, flipping the heavy radar transport trucks onto their sides and violently crushing the elevated launch canisters. Realizing the coastal bastion was entirely lost, surviving air defense crews abandoned their crippled hardware, scattering into the dusty hills to escape the advancing inferno. High above the devastated mainland, the American strike fighters leveled their wings and climbed back into the thin, cold air of the upper atmosphere. Inside the cramped cockpits of the F-35 Sea Lightning, 2 stealth fighters and the electronic attack aircraft, pilots watched their digital threat warning displays carefully. The chaotic lattice of hostile radar locks, active targeting beams, and surface-to-air missile warnings had completely vanished from their screens. The electronic spectrum, which had been violently shrieking with enemy fire control signals just 20 minutes earlier, was now completely dead. Miles offshore, the guided missile destroyers ceased their relentless bombardment. The heavy steel hatches of the vertical launch arrays slid shut, and the automated gun barrels on the forward decks rotated back to their resting positions. The entire Iranian missile bastion, engineered over decades to sever the Strait of Hormuz and deny access to the Gulf, no longer existed as a functioning military entity. The coastal defense formation had not simply been disrupted or suppressed. It had been physically erased from the map, leaving behind nothing but 20 miles of smoking rubble, collapsed mountain peaks, and absolute silence. The massive explosions that leveled the Jask coastal range finally ceased, leaving only the dull roar of burning rock and the slow collapse of shattered sandstone echoing across the water. Offshore, the American carrier strike group immediately transitioned from maximum offensive bombardment to absolute battlefield control. The immediate threat of a coordinated, subterranean anti-ship missile barrage had been eliminated, but the airspace above the Gulf of Oman was still thick with toxic smoke, and the unpredictable danger of surviving asymmetric forces remained. The fleet could not afford to lower its guard while operating just miles from a crippled but highly militarized mainland. Aboard the guided missile cruisers acting as the primary air defense shields for the carrier, operators pushed their AN/SPY-1 radar arrays to maximum sensitivity. The massive phased array panels scanned the blackened, heavily altered coastline, searching through the heavy thermal interference for any rogue launchers or isolated surface-to-air missile batteries that might have survived the catastrophic collapse of the mountain. The tactical screens, which had been chaotic webs of hostile targeting locks just 30 minutes earlier, now showed only the static, lifeless signatures of burning infrastructure. To visually confirm the total neutralization of the Jask sector and ensure the immediate coastal waters were clear of hidden fast attack boat ambushes, the fleet launched its combat search and rescue units. On the dark flight decks of the escorting destroyers and the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, heavy rotor blades began to chop through the humid night air. A flight of MH-60S Seahawk helicopters lifted off the steel decks, dropping their noses and accelerating low over the churning ocean surface. The helicopters approached the mainland at less than 100 feet above the swells, their pilots relying on advanced forward-looking infrared cameras to navigate through the dense, blinding fog of pulverized concrete and chemical exhaust. The intense heat radiating from the shoreline created dangerous, unpredictable updrafts that violently shook the heavy airframes. The acrid smell of sulfur and burning rocket propellant bled directly through the environmental seals of the helicopter cabins. As the assessment teams reached the shoreline, the true physical scale of the devastation finally became visible. The towering coastal ridge was entirely gone. In its place was a continuous, 20-mile stretch of glowing craters and collapsed, smoldering mountain slopes sliding directly into the sea. Hovering just off the ruined beaches, the Seahawk crews swept their heavy door-mounted machine guns across the floating debris, ready to engage any surviving hostile forces. The shallow water was choked with shattered fiberglass, twisted steel rebar, and the warped remnants of heavy hydraulic launch rails that had been thrown into the sea by the massive avalanches. Thermal imaging sensors peered into the deep ravines where the 6 primary missile caves had once stood, revealing only massive, superheated pits glowing bright white on the operators' screens. There was no movement on the ground. There were no surviving Revolutionary Guard crews attempting to salvage equipment. The random, muffled secondary explosions of deep magazines cooking off beneath the rubble were the only remaining signs of activity. High above the low-flying helicopters, advanced damage assessment aircraft carved slow circles through the upper atmosphere, continuously mapping the ruined subterranean complex and transmitting the high-resolution data back to the strike group commander. Out on the dark ocean, the massive warships slowly began to ease their gas turbine engines, maintaining a tight, impenetrable defensive perimeter, while the thick black smoke drifted slowly toward the east. The United States Navy had violently dismantled the most heavily fortified maritime chokepoint in the region, taking absolute control of the airspace and the sea. The tactical engagement on the water was entirely over, but the geopolitical shockwave of the strike was just beginning to radiate outward from the burning coastline. By the time the sun fully breached the horizon over the Gulf of Oman, the dense black smoke covering the Jask Peninsula began to drift eastward, revealing the absolute geographical alteration of the coastline. The towering sandstone ridges that had dominated the eastern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz for millennia were gone, replaced by a 20-mile stretch of smoking, pulverized craters, and collapsed rock. Deep beneath the rubble, the remnants of 6 massive subterranean missile caves and 20 shoreline rocket bunkers continued to burn, pushing a steady column of toxic white exhaust into the morning sky. The immediate tactical engagement was over, but as the physical dust settled over the dark water, a massive geopolitical shockwave began to radiate outward from the ruined mountain. Inland, deep inside the heavily fortified regional command centers of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the silence from the coastal sector was absolute. Commanders stared at blank tactical screens and severed fiber optic communication feeds. The Jask coastal range had not simply been a military base. It was the heavily engineered cornerstone of their sea denial strategy, designed to survive heavy bombardment and threaten international shipping with a massive, unstoppable barrage of anti-ship cruise missiles. Its complete eradication in less than 45 minutes by a single American carrier strike group shattered a decades-old strategic deterrent. The eastern flank of the critical maritime chokepoint had been violently torn open, leaving the mainland exposed and highly vulnerable. Within hours, high-resolution satellite imagery reached global intelligence desks across the world. In Allied command rooms and rival headquarters alike, analysts reviewed the intense infrared signatures radiating from the shattered peninsula. The heat bloom was so massive that early warning satellites had initially classified the event as a seismic anomaly before confirming the concentrated use of conventional bunker-busting thermobaric munitions. The sheer scale and precision of the preemptive American firepower sent a chilling, undeniable message to regional actors relying on similar subterranean arsenals. No mountain bunker was deep enough to survive a massed, combined arms strike from a fully mobilized naval formation. But the absolute destruction of the missile caves did not bring stability to the dark waters of the region. As news of the preemptive strike broke, global energy markets convulsed in panic. Commercial maritime traffic instantly froze. Dozens of heavy crude oil tankers bound for the Strait of Hormuz immediately dropped anchor or reversed course, fearing that the sudden decapitation of the Jask fortress would trigger an overwhelming asymmetric retaliation across the entire Middle East. The sea lanes, though temporarily cleared of the immediate shoreline threat, were now paralyzed by the certainty of a wider conflict. Out on the open ocean, 150 nautical miles from the burning coast, the United States Navy carrier strike group did not stand down. Aboard the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, flight deck crews wearing heavy respirators against the drifting chemical smoke worked frantically to refuel and rearm the returning stealth fighters. The guided missile destroyers maintained their tight defensive perimeter, their Aegis tracking arrays still pushing maximum energy into the sky. They had won the morning, erasing a heavily fortified mountain range from the map to save their ships from an overwhelming ambush. But as the carrier turned its massive bow into the wind to launch a fresh combat air patrol over the glowing ruins, the grim reality settled over the formation. The destruction of the Jask coastal range was not the end of the hostilities. It was only the devastating opening salvo of a much larger, darker war.